word consultation.
Joining me is Peter Credlin, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Peter, it's great to have you on board again. Hey, listen, how much of a problem is this? How much of a problem is this now for the government?
Well, I think it's a problem for Justice Gleeson, and you can see this afternoon that he's been forced to resign. And by all reports, he's a well-regarded lawyer. He is smart enough to know when he is the employee, not the employer, when he is the employee of the government and there's been a breakdown in the relationship, then it's time for him to go, him and not the elected official. And there's a lot being thrown around in the last couple of weeks about the nature of the Solicitor General, but the Solicitor General is basically the government's barrister. So the government is his client, and it's clear that there's been toing and froing about a number of issues, not least of all the consultation that you just showed in that grab, and I can elaborate on that. So the relationship has broken down. It was time for him to go. It was untenable that he stayed, and I think this will be the end of it.
You think so? But I don't know that's the case, because there's still the issue, isn't there, of whether George Brandis did mislead Parliament.
I don't think he did, Andrew. I don't think he did. He was asked the question, did you consult with the Solicitor General? And he did. There's only one decision maker, and that is George Brandis. Legally, for that direction to be made, there is one decision maker. It wasn't a co-decision to be made by both men. George Brandis is required to consult with the Solicitor General as he makes the decision. He's not required to consult the Solicitor General on the decision, or that they make it together. He consulted, he then made his decision. Gleeson has his nose out of joint that he didn't like the decision. Well, you know, join a long queue. Governments make decisions you don't like. But if you are properly consulted, then the AG has met that test. He's not the High Court judge.
Well, it depends, isn't it?
He's not the 8th High Court judge.
No.
He's a barrister for the government.
No, but the law says you've got to be consulted. I think the issue is that Gleeson says he wasn't consulted about what Brandis had in mind to solve this problem. He was only consulted about general issues, not on the actual measure. And I think there's room for a debate on that point.
I disagree. I disagree. What George Brandis was trying to ensure is, as the first law officer, Brandis, the second law officer, Gleeson, would be in constant contact with him regarding advice that the government sought. What you don't want to have happen is that, say, secretaries of departments or public servants will go and seek out their own legal advice to challenge their ministers. I'm not saying that happened, but without a direction that puts all of that material before the Attorney General, before supplementary advice is sought from the AG, then that's a real risk. That's a real risk. And so I think it's prudent that the direction is there.
No, but that's different. That's different. For me, the issue of the fix, whether it was good or bad, that's a different issue. But today, Peter, this is the trouble, you know. Similar revelation, as I pointed out to Matt Canavan, a letter released through FIO, showing the former Secretary of the Agriculture Department writing to Barnaby Joyce, saying he no longer had confidence in Joyce's integrity after resolving issues after Joyce's staff changed Hansard. Then it was Grimes who again quit. You know, the public servant. I mean, there seems to be a pattern here, isn't there?
I think in any job, if you've lost confidence in your boss, or your boss has lost confidence in you, unless you can resolve those issues, it's time to go. And I think these are big jobs. They rely on a lot of trust. Yes, you know, the people who hold these jobs are by and large honourable and they're smart, but if the relationship in a personal sense and the trust is broken down, then there's not much else you've got left but to fall on your sword. Either side. I mean, there's been cases where ministers have resigned from their jobs because they've no longer got confidence in where the government's going. I know in opposition there were a raft of resignations around the time of the emissions trading scheme because people lost confidence in the policy. So I don't think that's unusual, and I think that actually shows the system is pretty honourable and it works.
Okay, well, there is rumours that maybe Turnbull wouldn't mind if Brandis took up a job as High Commissioner in London. That would get him out of Parliament, and possibly then leave a space that could be filled, some reporters are suggesting, by Tony Abbott. Now, do you have any insight into either half of that suggestion?
Well, first of all, Alexander Downer is there, and it's not been in London as High Commissioner, and it hasn't been announced that he's going. So I think you know, this is the usual Canberra scuttlebutt. People always want someone in the ministry to move if you're an ambitious backbencher or, you know, junior minister, because that means there's an opening and, you know, the seats get moved around. I think George would make a great High Commissioner to London. He's got a long history in the law. A lot of counter-terrorism work is done in London. It's part of the Five Eyes community. And of course, he's an ex-Oxford graduate, so there's a natural fit. But I don't think there's a vacancy at this time. And I think there's a lot that the government needs sort of a steady hand like Brandis about to assist with. And with a one-seat majority, and yes, he's a senator, he's probably all you can afford to retire. You certainly don't want retirements out of the House at the moment with a one-seat majority in a by-election. I just don't think it's a priority for the government. I think
as a senator, that wouldn't be an issue.
Correct, that's exactly right.
But listen, what about the speculation Greg Sheridan raised in The Australian? I think I've got problems with it. The idea that Tony Abbott should be appointed to the cabinet or at least the ministry, and that would give him something to do and make Malcolm Turnbull's life a lot easier. Do you actually see that? I mean, I can't really imagine that Malcolm Turnbull will give Tony Abbott the position that Tony Abbott gave Malcolm Turnbull and Malcolm Turnbull used to knife Tony Abbott. Why would he do that?
I think this is just a whole lot of tarot cards. Everyone, you know, there is no vacancy in the cabinet. Malcolm Turnbull has ruled out putting Tony Abbott in the cabinet, and Tony Abbott isn't asking. And I think really over the last 4 or 5 days, yes, there's the issue in a policy sense about the Adler weapon from last week, but there's been a lot of hyperventilation, Andrew, over the weekend about these great big sort of schism between the two men. I don't see that at all. I think that, you know, of course there's going to be an element of angst between someone who took another person's job. If you go back to 2009, you know, Malcolm lost his job to Tony, and Tony's now lost his job to Malcolm. There's a level of enmity there. However, they are both determined to make the coalition government a success. You can't fault the way that Tony Abbott played the campaign. Both Malcolm and Tony are squarely looking at Labor as where the fight needs to be. And the polls tell you that unless the coalition is united, Labor will continue to gain ground. And I think it's less between the two men and more about everybody else being fixated to try and remake a Rudd sort of Gillard contest. And that's not what this is about. Both of them are committed to the coalition.
And yet, Peter, I see so many Liberal sources briefing journalists that Abbott got a defeat, got slapped around by Malcolm Turnbull over the Liberal voting rules in New South Wales. He had his authority diminished.
Wrong, Andrew. So wrong.
He should shut up, he should get out, he should this.
But you know what? With great respect to some of your journalistic colleagues, Andrew, they're so dim when it comes to what actually happened on that weekend. For example, Tony Abbott didn't own that motion. The Warringah branch, of which he is the elected official for that seat, did. They did not want to withdraw the motion. They moved the motion and the motion was put. It's not Tony Abbott. And if people were a little bit more informed, then over the weekend we wouldn't have had this confected brouhaha about two men who are trying to get on with the place in life that they're both at, one being Prime Minister, one being a former Prime Minister, now backbencher, and their guns are turned on the Labor Party. And I think it's really important that if the Prime Minister can talk to the backbenchers or others or ministers or apparatchiks who are doing all the backgrounding, half of this issue might go away. People have got to learn discipline on both sides of politics, but particularly the Liberal Party, because you get into trouble with backgrounding and you never get out of it with backgrounding.
Peta Credlin, peacemaker extraordinaire, thank you so much for your time.
I don't think I've ever been called that, but thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, I coined a word.